The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered buildings of Copper Valley as Sarah Chen stood on her front porch, sipping black coffee from a chipped mug that had seen better days. At 45, she appeared to be nothing more than a quiet bookstore owner, someone who kept to herself in this small Arizona town. What the approaching black SUVs didn't know was that before she became Mrs. Chen, she had been known as Shadow, the last surviving member of the notorious Ghost Dragon crew, the most skilled infiltration gang the West Coast had ever seen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The desert wind whispered through the streets of Copper Valley, Arizona, carrying the scent of sage and dust as it wound its way past Sarah Chen's modest bookstore. The faded sign above the door read Valley Books and Cafe in peeling gold letters, a remnant of her late husband Michael's original design. At 45, Sarah moved with a grace that most mistook for natural elegance, never guessing it came from years of practicing the art of becoming invisible in plain sight. The morning routine was always the same: unlock the heavy wooden door at precisely 7 a.m., arrange the fresh pastries from old Mrs. Rodriguez's bakery in the small cafe section, and ensure the new releases were properly displayed in the window. Today's bestsellers were mostly true crime novels, a fact that often made Sarah smile privately at the irony. Through the large storefront windows, she watched the town slowly come to life. Deputy Garcia made his usual morning rounds, tipping his hat as he passed. The local high school kids began trickling in for their morning coffee and breakfast, their backpacks slung carelessly over their shoulders. To them, she was just Ms. Chen, the quiet widow who made the best chai lattes in 3 counties and always had a kind word or helpful book recommendation. The bookstore had been Michael's dream. A former literature professor turned small-town entrepreneur, he'd fallen in love with Copper Valley's peaceful atmosphere and convinced Sarah to settle here 8 years ago. The fact that it was over 1,000 miles from her former territory on the West Coast had been a significant factor in their choice, though Michael never knew that part. Sarah adjusted the silver locket around her neck, the only piece of jewelry she wore besides her wedding ring. Inside was a small key, its significance known only to her. The safety deposit box it opened hadn't been touched in 7 years, not since Michael's cancer diagnosis had given her a reason to truly embrace this quiet life. The morning crowd had thinned out when Sarah noticed something unusual through the window. A sleek black Mercedes pulled up outside the realtor's office across the street, followed by 2 equally expensive SUVs. The vehicles were spotless despite the dusty desert roads, suggesting they hadn't been in town long. The men who emerged moved with a calculated precision that immediately set off warning bells in Sarah's mind. She recognized the practiced coordination of people used to working as a unit. Behind the counter, her hands automatically catalogued the nearest defensive positions, old instincts rising to the surface. The cafe's layout had been her one insistence when they'd renovated: clear sightlines to all entrances, multiple exit routes, and a solid oak counter that could stop more than just coffee spills. Michael had attributed it to her feng shui interests, never suspecting it was muscle memory from a life she'd left behind. The wall of mystery books behind her concealed a narrow corridor that led to the building's rear exit, a modification she'd made shortly after Michael's passing. The locals had assumed it was grief-driven renovation, never guessing that the widow's remodeling project included reinforced walls and a hidden escape route. Sarah watched as the men entered the realtor's office. Their leader, a tall man in an expensive charcoal suit, carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from always getting his way. Through the large windows, she could see him gesturing emphatically at maps spread across the realtor's desk. The two men flanking him maintained positions that gave them clear views of both the street and their boss, not obvious to casual observers, but clear as day to someone who'd spent years reading similar formations. Old Tom Harper, shuffling past, with his morning paper, paused to peer through the realtor's window. Sarah tensed slightly as one of the suited men moved to block his view, using a little too much authority in his gesture for a simple real estate transaction. Tom hurried away, but not before Sarah caught the flash of concern across his weathered face. The bell above her door chimed as Mayor Wilson entered, his usually cheerful demeanor subdued. "Morning, Sarah," he said, making his way to the counter. His eyes darted briefly to the scene across the street before settling on her. The usual, "Please." As Sarah prepared his favorite, Americano with an extra shot, she noted the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers drummed nervously on the counter. "New investors in town?" she asked casually, her voice carrying the soft lilt that most attributed to her Chinese-American heritage, rather than years of practicing to sound unthreatening. The mayor's sigh carried the weight of genuine worry. "They're calling themselves Phoenix Development. Showed up last week with plans to revitalize downtown." His fingers made air quotes around the world. "Been buying up properties all along Main Street. Or trying to, anyway." Sarah's mind automatically began connecting dots, a skill honed through years of planning complex operations. The timing coincided with the recent closure of 3 local businesses, including the hardware store that had operated continuously since 1955. At the time, the owners had cited personal reasons, but their hasty departures had seemed out of character. "Interesting timing," she murmured, more to herself than the mayor. Through the window, she watched as the men exited the realtor's office, their body language suggesting the meeting hadn't gone as planned. The leader paused on the sidewalk, his gaze sweeping the street before settling on her bookstore. Something in his expression made her fingers instinctively trace the outline of the knife she kept strapped to her forearm, hidden beneath her loose-fitting cardigan. The mayor followed her gaze, his voice dropping. "Listen, Sarah, they've been asking about your place. I know since Michael—" He trailed off, uncomfortable. "Well, they seem to think you might be interested in selling. Just be careful, okay? Some folks who've turned them down have had bad luck lately." Sarah's smile remained gentle, but her eyes hardened imperceptibly as she watched the men return to their vehicles. She recognized their type. Wolves in expensive suits, using intimidation and accidents to force people into selling. 7 years ago, she would have handled this very differently, but Michael had shown her another way to live. The Mercedes pulled away from the curb, but not before its driver made a point of studying her storefront. Sarah knew that look. She'd worn it herself many times when chasing a target. They'd be back, probably thinking they'd found an easy mark. A middle-aged widow running a small bookstore in a dying downtown. What they didn't know was that before, she was Sarah Chen, loving wife and local bookstore owner. She had been Lei Shadow Zhang, the most elusive member of the Ghost Dragons. For 15 years, she had been the crew's infiltration specialist, the one they called when they needed to get in and out of anywhere undetected. The skills that had once made her infamous in certain circles hadn't faded. They'd just been redirected into creating the perfect cover. As she wiped down the counter, Sarah thought about the safety deposit box key hanging around her neck. Inside that box were things from her old life, documents, connections, and resources that she'd promised Michael. She'd never use again. But Michael was gone now, and it seemed Copper Valley needed something more than just a quiet widow who made good coffee. The morning sun climbed higher, painting the desert town in shades of gold and amber. Sarah watched as Deputy Garcia made another pass, his pace slightly quicker as he hurried past the expensive black vehicles. Soon she knew she would have visitors. They would come with smooth words and subtle threats, expecting to find a helpless woman they could easily pressure into selling. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Instead, they would be walking into the lair of Shadow, the last ghost dragon, who had once orchestrated some of the most intricate operations the criminal underworld had ever seen. And if they thought they could threaten her community, well, she hadn't forgotten how to bite. The first signs of trouble appeared 3 days after the black Mercedes' initial visit to Copper Valley. Sarah noticed them in the small details that most would overlook, the way certain customers lingered too long without buying anything, how unfamiliar vehicles cruised past her store during odd hours, the subtle increase in photography tourists, who seemed more interested in building facades than desert landscapes. Downtown Copper Valley had 17 security cameras scattered across various businesses. Sarah had memorized their positions and blind spots within her first week of living here. Old habits die hard. Now, she noticed 3 new ones had appeared overnight, all with clear views of her storefront. Professional installations, not the usual local contractor work. The morning paper, delivered by young Tommy Martinez on his bike route, carried troubling news. The city council had called an emergency meeting to discuss new zoning regulations. Sarah read between the lines. Someone was trying to change the rules, likely to pressure holdout property owners. "Got a minute, Ms. Chen?" Tommy asked, lingering by the counter instead of rushing off to finish his route. The teenager had been working on a history project about Copper Valley's founding, spending hours in her store's local interest section. Something weird happened yesterday. Sarah set aside her inventory list, noting how the boy's eyes kept darting to the windows. "What's on your mind, Tommy?" "These guys in suits, they stopped me after school. Asked about you and the store." He fidgeted with his baseball cap. "Wanted to know if you ever talked about selling, if you seemed lonely here since." Sarah's expression remained neutral, but her mind raced. They were gathering intelligence, building a profile. "What did you tell them?" "That it wasn't any of their business," Tommy declared proudly. "But then this morning, my bike tires were slashed. Both of them. Dad says it was probably just kids," but Sarah reached under the counter, pulling out her emergency cash box. "Here," she handed him $60. "For new tires. Consider it a thank you for all your help with the morning deliveries." After Tommy left, Sarah did something she hadn't done in 7 years. She activated an old email account, one she'd maintained but never used since settling in Copper Valley. The password was a string of characters based on the date she'd met Michael, making it both memorable and impossible to guess. 3 new messages awaited her, all from the past week. The first was simple coordinates, pointing to a location 50 miles outside Phoenix. The second contained a single line: "Ghost whispers say dragons are being hunted." The third was the most recent, sent just 2 days ago. "Shadow, the old crews are gone. You're the last one." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. She'd known most of her former crew was dead or imprisoned, but seeing it confirmed made something shift inside her. The ghost dragons had been more than just a gang. They'd been family before she'd found a new one with Michael. The bell above. The door chimed. Sarah closed the browser window, turning to greet what she expected to be her usual mid-morning customers. Instead, she found herself looking at an impeccably dressed woman who moved with the calculated grace of someone used to commanding attention. "Mrs. Chen," the woman's smile was practiced, professional. "I'm Diana Voss, representing Phoenix Development." She placed a business card on the counter, heavy cardstock, gold embossing, no physical address listed. "I was hoping we could discuss an opportunity." Sarah picked up the card, noting the slight tremor in Diana's left hand, designer bracelet concealing what looked like recent bruising. I'm afraid I'm quite busy with inventory today, Ms. Voss. Please, call me Diana. She glanced around the store, her gaze lingering on the security cameras Sarah had installed, obvious ones meant to be seen. This is such a charming space. It must be difficult, maintaining it all on your own since your husband's passing. The mention of Michael was deliberate, a probe for weakness. 7 years ago, Sarah would have noted at least 3 ways to make this woman disappear without a trace. Now, she simply smiled, the same gentle expression she'd perfected for recommending books to uncertain readers. I manage quite well, thank you. Sarah's tone was polite but firm. The community has been very supportive. Diana's smile tightened slightly. Yes, community is important, which is why Phoenix Development is committed to revitalizing downtown Copper Valley. We have plans to transform this entire block into a modern shopping and dining destination. Property values would increase significantly. How interesting. Sarah began restocking the mystery section, noting how Diana's eyes followed her movements. Though I'm curious why you'd start with the most stable part of downtown. The abandoned warehouse district seems more in need of revitalization. A flicker of surprise crossed Diana's face. Most people didn't question Phoenix Development's choices. The warehouse district is Phase 2. We prefer to establish a strong presence in the heart of the community first. You mean you prefer to control the water rights that come with these properties? Sarah corrected mildly, shelving the latest James Patterson novel. Since the warehouse district relies on separate wells. This time, Diana's surprise was more pronounced. Few people knew about Copper Valley's complex water rights system. Sarah had studied it extensively before buying the building. Another habit from her former life: always know the true value of your target. You seem very well informed for a bookstore owner, Mrs. Chen. Knowledge is my business. Sarah turned back to face her visitor. Just as pressure and intimidation appear to be yours. Diana's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something harder underneath. I'm not sure what you mean. 3 businesses on this block have closed in the past month. Tommy Martinez's bike tires were slashed after he refused to answer questions about me. And your left wrist suggests you recently discovered the consequences of disappointing your employers. Sarah's voice remained conversational, but her eyes held Diana's with an intensity that made the other woman step back. Did I miss anything? I should go. Diana's composure cracked further. But my associates will be in touch. I suggest you seriously consider our offer when it comes. Changes are coming to Copper Valley, Mrs. Chen. Best to be on the right side of them. After Diana left, Sarah opened her laptop again, this time accessing a private server she hadn't visited since settling in Copper Valley. The ghost dragons might be gone, but their information network has been legendary. Within an hour, she had preliminary data on Phoenix Development, a shell company with ties to larger corporations, all leading back to a private equity firm specializing in water rights acquisition. A knock at her back door interrupted her research. Through the security feed, she recognized Officer Garcia. The deputy looked nervous, glancing over his shoulder as he waited. "Come in, Marco!" Sarah called out, quickly closing her laptop. The young officer had been one of Michael's favorite students, back when her husband still taught literature at the local community college. "Ms. Chen," Garcia removed his hat, twisting it anxiously. "I shouldn't be here, but you need to know something. These Phoenix Development people, they've got the department running scared. Chief had a private meeting with them yesterday and came out looking like he'd seen a ghost." Sarah's mind flashed to the new security cameras. "They're planning something," Garcia nodded. "Word is they're bringing in private security tonight, lots of them. Chief's ordered us to stay clear of downtown after midnight, said it's for a training exercise." "Thank you, Marco." Sarah's voice was gentle, but her mind was already running through scenarios, calculating angles and escape routes. "You should go. Best if no one knows you were here." After the deputy left, Sarah went to her private office above the store. The room was Spartan except for two things: a wall of photos showing her life with Michael and a locked cabinet that hadn't been opened since she'd moved in. The key around her neck fit perfectly, revealing a collection of burner phones, cash in various currencies, and a small tablet that contained everything she'd ever known about her former crew's operations. Sarah's fingers hovered over the tablet. Using any of this meant breaking her promise to Michael, crossing a line back into a world she'd left behind. But as she looked at their photos on the wall, Michael teaching, Michael laughing, Michael showing her how to live without violence, she remembered something he'd said during his final days. "The past doesn't define you, Lay," he told her, using her real name as he always did in private. "It prepares you. What matters is how you use what you've learned." As evening approached, Sarah retrieved a small notebook from behind a brick in the fireplace, another old habit Michael had attributed to her quirky organization system. Inside were detailed notes about every unusual incident in Copper Valley over the past 3 months. Pages of seemingly random observations now formed a clear pattern: the Henderson family's century-old hardware store closing after 3 generations, strange equipment failures at the local water treatment facility, unexpected tax audits on businesses that refused Phoenix Development's initial offers, the mysterious fire at Old Man Jenkins's document storage facility, which had contained most of the town's historical property records. The sun was setting over Copper Valley, painting the desert sky in shades of purple and gold. Sarah watched through her office window as Diana Voss's warning played out. Unmarked vans began arriving at the edges of downtown, disgorging men in tactical gear who moved with military precision. They were establishing a perimeter, preparing for something big. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Tommy. More suits at the diner, asking about water tables and property maps. Another message followed quickly, this one from Mayor Wilson. Emergency council meeting called for tomorrow morning. They're trying to force through some kind of emergency redevelopment ordinance. Sarah looked again at the wall of photos, at the life she'd built here. Michael had shown her it was possible to start over, to use her skills for something better than crime. Now those same skills might be the only thing that could protect the community that had given her a second chance. Sarah moved silently through her store's back room, retrieving items she'd hidden years ago. A high-end laptop with custom security features, a set of lockpicks disguised as knitting needles, and a small black case containing surveillance equipment that would put Phoenix Development's cameras to shame. As she worked, her mind drifted to her Ghost Dragon days. The crew had specialized in gathering leverage, finding secrets powerful, people wanted to keep hidden. They'd never been mindless thugs. Their strength had been in intelligence gathering, strategic planning, and precise execution. Those skills hadn't faded. They'd just been repurposed for inventory management and book ordering. Now, watching through her windows as more private security forces positioned themselves around downtown, Sarah realized something important. Phoenix Development was using the same playbook her crew once had. Isolation, pressure, strategic accidents. But they were using it to destroy rather than acquire. That made them predictable. A message flashed on her burner phone, an automated alert from one of her old monitoring systems. Someone was accessing sealed records about Copper Valley's water rights, dating back to the 1800s. The same records that had mysteriously vanished from the county courthouse last month. Sarah methodically prepared for the night ahead, her movements precise and economical. From a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, she retrieved a small USB drive containing everything she'd ever discovered about Copper Valley's true power structure. property records, water rights, underground aquifer maps that even the city council didn't know existed. The store's security cameras picked up more movement outside. Men in tactical gear were establishing observation posts in the abandoned dentist's office across the street. Their equipment was military grade, but their positioning was sloppy, clearly hired muscle rather than trained professionals. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Mrs. Rodriguez from the bakery. "Sarah, strange men asking questions about..." The store's basement said they were from the building inspector's office, but Miguel saw them get out of those black SUVs. The basement. Sarah's lips curved into a slight smile. Phoenix Development's research was thorough but incomplete. They'd found the public records showing a basement level, but not the sealed documents about the Prohibition-era tunnel system that connected several downtown buildings. Tunnels she'd carefully mapped during her first month in town, another hobby Michael had lovingly teased her about. A knock at the back door made her freeze. On the security feed, she saw Tommy Martinez again, but this time he wasn't alone. His father, Diego, stood with him, looking worried. "Miss Chen," Diego said quietly when she let them in, "Tommy told me about those men, about his bike. There's more. They've been pressuring all the delivery drivers, trying to get us to stop supplying. Businesses that won't sell." Sarah's mind raced. Supply line disruption. It was a tactic she'd seen before, usually preceding more aggressive moves. "How many drivers?" "All of us. They're offering double rates to deliver only to businesses that cooperate with Phoenix Development. Those who refuse..." He gestured to Tommy's bike outside. "Things happen." This was escalating faster than she'd anticipated. Phoenix Development wasn't just gathering intelligence anymore. They were actively isolating targets. Sarah made a quick decision. "Diego, I need you to spread the word. Quietly. Tell everyone who's being pressured to keep detailed records, photos, dates, names if possible, and..." She hesitated, then continued. "If anyone needs a safe place to store documents or backup records, my basement is secure." After they left, Sarah returned to her surveillance equipment. The tablet from her old life was showing interesting data. Phoenix Development's shell company structure was complex, but there were patterns. The same names kept appearing in different configurations, all leading back to a private equity firm called Meridian Holdings. A message popped up on her secure email, an automated alert from one of her old system traces. Someone was trying to access sealed records about Michael's death. They were digging, looking for pressure points. Sarah felt a familiar cold clarity settle over her mind. She'd left her old life behind, had built something real here in Copper Valley. These people thought they could use her past against her, thought her husband's death had left her vulnerable. But they'd made a crucial mistake. They assumed she'd gone soft, that 7 years of running a bookstore had dulled her edges. They didn't understand that every skill she'd learned as Shadow, the patience, the planning, the ability to see patterns and predict movements, had only been refined by her time here. Through her window, she watched as more private security forces took up positions around downtown. They were preparing for something big, probably timed to coincide with tomorrow's emergency council meeting. They thought they had all the pieces in place, thought they were dealing with a simple widow who would crumble under pressure. Sarah began powering up her equipment, her movements precise and practiced. Tomorrow, Phoenix Development would learn why the Ghost Dragons had been feared not for their violence, but for their ability to turn an enemy's plans against them. The last dragon was awakening, and this time she had something worth fighting for. A home, a community, and the legacy of a man who had taught her that her skills could be used to protect instead of harm. Dawn painted the desert sky in shades of crimson when the first customer arrived at Valley Books and Cafe. Sarah recognized him immediately, not a regular, but someone trying hard to look like one. His business casual attire was too pressed for 6 a.m., his leather shoes too expensive for local tastes. Most tellingly, he ordered using the generic menu terms instead of the local nicknames her regulars favored. "Lovely store you have here," he commented, eyes scanning the layout with too much interest. "Must be difficult keeping a place like this profitable in such a small town." Sarah continued preparing his Americano, noting how his right hand kept brushing the slight bulge under his jacket. Amateur. If he was trying to conceal a weapon, he should have opted for a looser fit. "We manage. Copper Valley takes care of its own." The man, who had introduced himself as James Walker, settled at a table with clear sightlines to both entrances. Within an hour, 3 more customers had arrived, positioning themselves throughout the store. Their coordinated movements might have been subtle to untrained eyes, but to Sarah they might as well have been wearing neon signs announcing their intentions. At precisely 8:30 a.m., the bell above the door chimed again. This time, Sarah recognized the man who entered, Marcus Cole, the one who'd been in the black Mercedes days earlier. His charcoal suit probably cost more than most locals made in a month, but it was his eyes that caught her attention. Cold, calculating, the kind of gaze she'd seen in mirrors during her Ghost Dragon days. "Mrs. Chen," his voice carried the smooth confidence of someone used to getting his way. "I believe Ms. Voss mentioned I'd be stopping by." He approached the counter, flanked by 2 men whose stances screamed private security. "I hope now is a convenient time to discuss business." Sarah's smile remained pleasant, practiced. "I'm afraid I won't take business meetings before my morning rush, Mr. Cole. Perhaps you could come back after lunch." Cole's answering smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm afraid this can't wait. You see, the city council is meeting in..." He made a show of checking his watch. "About 30 minutes to vote on some rather important zoning changes that could significantly impact businesses like yours." Through the window, Sarah noticed more black SUVs arriving, disgorging. Men in tactical gear who took up positions around the block. They were creating a perimeter, ensuring no interruptions. An older woman walking her dog quickly changed direction upon seeing them. "Is the show of force really necessary?" Sarah asked mildly, starting another pot of coffee. The familiar routine helped mask how her mind was racing, calculating angles and options. "Seems excessive for a simple business discussion." Cole's smile widened fractionally. "Just being thorough, Mrs. Chen. We found that some people can be unreasonable when discussing property values. Speaking of which," he placed a thick envelope on the counter, "this is our final offer for your building. I suggest you review it carefully." Sarah didn't touch the envelope. Instead, she began wiping down the espresso machine, a task that conveniently kept her hands busy and in view. "And if I'm not interested in selling, then things could become complicated." Cole gestured around. "The store. Running a business involves so many variables: health inspections, building codes, insurance rates. Accidents happen, especially in older buildings like this one." As if on cue, one of his men brushed past a bookshelf, sending several volumes tumbling to the floor. The message wasn't subtle. "Interesting timing," Sarah noted, her voice carrying just enough edge to make Cole's security men tense slightly. These complications wouldn't have anything to do with the Hendersons' hardware store fire, would they? Or perhaps Mr. Jenkins's missing property records? A flicker of surprise crossed Cole's face before his smooth mask settled back into place. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Mrs. Chen. We're simply business people interested in revitalizing a struggling community." "By cutting off its water supply." The words made Cole's jaw tighten imperceptibly. "That is the end game, isn't it? Control the downtown properties. Control the historical water rights that come with them. Then, when the warehouse district developments begin, you control who gets access." This time, Cole's surprise was more evident. He studied her with new interest. Reassessing, you seem very well informed for a simple bookstore owner. Knowledge is my business. Sarah met his gaze steadily. Just as acquisition through intimidation appears to be yours. Cole's pleasant demeanor cracked slightly. He nodded to one of his men, who moved to flip the open sign to closed and lock the front door. The remaining customers stood, abandoning any pretense of browsing. Mrs. Chen, or should I say Ms. Zhang? Cole's use of her former name made Sarah's fingers still on the espresso machine. Yes, we've done our homework too, though I admit finding information about your past proved challenging. Sarah's mind raced. They'd discovered her original identity, but how much did they really know? The ghost dragons had been meticulous about maintaining anonymity. It was why she'd survived when others hadn't. It's interesting, Cole continued, clearly enjoying what he assumed was the upper hand. A woman with your particular history, choosing to settle in such a quiet place, running a bookstore of all things. I wonder what your customers would think if certain details about your past came to light. Sarah's laugh was soft, but carried an edge that made Cole's security men shift uneasily. Is that really the card you want to play, Mr. Cole? Threatening to expose secrets? She turned to face him fully. Because I've spent the last 7 years learning everything there is to know about this town. Every connection, every hidden deal, every skeleton in every closet. It's amazing what people tell their local bookseller. Cole's confident smile faltered slightly. Are you threatening me, Mrs. Chen? Not at all. Sarah's voice remained conversational. I'm simply pointing out that in a small town like this, information flows both ways. For instance, I know exactly why Phoenix Development is so interested in Copper Valley's water rights, just as I know about the similar pattern in other towns, the mysterious fires, the convenient accidents, the pressure on local officials. She reached beneath the counter, producing a thick folder. I also know about Meridian Holdings' involvement in the California water wars and the 3 ongoing federal investigations into their acquisition methods. Amazing what you can find in public records if you know where to look. Cole's face had gone very still. One of his men moved forward, reaching for the folder, but Sarah's next words stopped him cold. That's just a copy, of course. The originals, along with considerably more interesting documentation, have been distributed to several secure locations. Dead Man's Switch. If anything happens to me or my property, everything goes public. I believe your investors would find that inconvenient. The tension in the room had shifted palpably. Cole's men looked to him for direction, uncertain how their simple intimidation mission had turned into this. Their target wasn't behaving like the helpless widow they'd expected. You're bluffing, Cole said finally. But there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. Sarah smiled, the same gentle expression she used when recommending books to children. Would you like to test that theory? I'm sure your investors would understand if their entire operation was exposed because you couldn't handle one small-town bookstore. She noted how his hands clenched slightly at the mention of investors. There, it was, his pressure point. Cole wasn't the top of the chain. He answered to someone else, someone who wouldn't tolerate failure. Of course, she continued, we could approach this differently. I have no interest in causing trouble for Phoenix Development, assuming you have no interest in causing trouble. For Copper Valley. Cole studied her for a long moment, reassessing. When he spoke, his voice had lost some of its smooth confidence. What exactly are you proposing? Simple. Phoenix Development withdraws its interest in downtown Copper Valley. Focus your revitalization efforts on the warehouse district. Plenty of development opportunities there without the complicated water rights issues. In return, my research stays private. The warehouse district is worthless without control of the water supply, Cole objected. Only if you're planning to exploit it, Sarah countered. But legitimate development, that's another matter entirely. I'm sure your investors would prefer steady legal profits over risky criminal endeavors. Through the windows she could see more locals gathering, watching the scene unfold. Deputy Garcia's patrol car had parked across the street, lights off but engine running. The community wasn't as helpless as Phoenix Development had assumed. Cole's phone buzzed, a message that made his expression darken. After a moment, he squared his shoulders. "This isn't over, Mrs. Chen." "Actually, it is." Sarah's voice hardened, for the first time, carrying an authority that made Cole's security men step back instinctively. "You have exactly 30 seconds to get your men out of my store." After that, I started making calls, first to the FBI's white-collar crime division, then to several very interested journalists who've been tracking Meridian Holdings' activities. She watched the calculations play out behind Cole's eyes. The risk versus reward, the potential fallout, the questions his investors would ask if he failed here. Finally, he nodded sharply to his men. "A strategic withdrawal," he said, trying to maintain some dignity. "But don't think this is finished." "Oh, I know it isn't," Sarah agreed pleasantly. "Which is why I've ensured that any further complications, accidents, pressure on local businesses, mysterious fires, will trigger the release of everything I have. Consider it insurance." As Cole and his men filed out, Sarah noted how the locals outside quickly dispersed, not wanting to appear too obvious in their observation. The community's resistance wasn't organized yet, but the potential was there. People were starting to stand together. Once they were gone, Sarah allowed herself a small sigh. The confrontation had gone as well as could be expected, but she knew this was just the beginning. Cole would report back to his superiors, and they would start digging deeper. Eventually, they would discover exactly who they were dealing with. The last surviving member of the Ghost Dragons, a woman who had once specialized in turning corporations' own schemes against them. After the bell chimed one final time behind Cole's departing figure, Sarah waited exactly 3 minutes before moving. Her old crew had always followed the 3-minute rule. Enough time for an enemy to think they're clear, not enough time for them to set up countermeasures. The USB drive she pulled from her pocket contained a program she hadn't used in years. Within moments, it was copying every text, email, and call from the phones that had been inside her store. Cole's men had been sloppy, leaving their Bluetooth enabled. Their devices might be encrypted, but she'd learned long ago that even the best security was vulnerable if you knew where to look. A soft knock at the back door interrupted her work. Through the security feed, she saw Mayor Wilson, accompanied by Deputy Garcia and, surprisingly, Diana Voss. The Phoenix Development representative looked significantly less polished than during her previous visit. "Come in," Sarah called out, quickly minimizing her hacking program. The three entered, Diana noticeably hanging back. "Sarah," the mayor began, then stopped, clearly unsure how to proceed. "That was... what just happened here?" "A business negotiation," Sarah replied mildly, starting a fresh pot of coffee. "Would anyone like some?" Diana stepped forward, her designer composure cracked. "Mrs. Chen, I need to tell you something. About Phoenix Development, about what they're really planning." Sarah studied the woman carefully. The bruising on her wrist had darkened, and there was a new tension around her eyes. "You're ready to talk?" "They're not just after water rights." Diana's words came in a rush. "The aquifer under Copper Valley. It's not just about controlling water supply. There's something else, something in the old mining surveys that they found." A series of rapid beeps from Sarah's laptop interrupted Diana's revelation. Someone was trying to access her store's security system remotely. Amateur work, but persistent. "Deputy," Sarah turned to Garcia, "I believe you'll find some interesting activity at the old mining office. Cole's men seem very interested in those buildings all of a sudden." Garcia nodded, already heading for the door. "I'll have my men keep an eye on it. And I've got a council meeting to cancel." Mayor Wilson added grimly. These emergency rezoning proposals need a closer look. After they left, only Diana remained, looking lost. They'll come after me now, she said quietly. I know too much. Sarah's mind raced through options. Diana could be a valuable source of information, but she'd need protection. There's a safe house in Phoenix, she found herself saying, run by people who help corporate whistleblowers disappear. Are you interested? Diana's eyes widened slightly. How do you know about... Let's just say this isn't my first time dealing with corporate takeover attempts. Sarah wrote down a number on a piece of paper. Call this contact. Tell them Shadow sent you. As Diana left through the back door, Sarah returned to her computer. Cole's hasty retreat had given her an opening, but she knew better than to assume this was over. Phoenix Development hadn't gotten this far by giving up easily. Her screen showed the data streaming in from Cole's compromised phones. Meeting locations, contact numbers, pieces of a larger puzzle. But it was a text message from an unknown number that caught her attention. Target has unexpected resources. Ghost Dragon connection confirmed. Await further instructions. Sarah's lips curved into a slight smile. They thought confirming her identity gave them an advantage. They didn't realize that knowing she was Shadow should have been their warning to stay very, very far from Copper Valley. Because while Sarah Chen might run a bookstore now, the skills that had made Shadow legendary hadn't faded. They'd been refined, focused, turned toward protection rather than profit. Phoenix Development was about to learn why the Ghost Dragons had been feared not for their violence, but for their ability to turn an enemy's own plans into their downfall. The morning. Sun climbed higher over Copper Valley, its harsh light illuminating the empty street where Cole's SUVs had been. Sarah began composing a message of her own, to be sent through channels she hadn't used in 7 years. It was time to remind certain people why crossing Shadow was considered suicide in some circles. Sarah's burner phone lit up with a series of messages from old contacts, people who owed favors to Shadow, debts that had never been collected. Each response confirmed what she'd suspected. Phoenix Development's pattern extended far beyond Copper Valley. An encrypted email from a former hacker colleague contained satellite imagery of similar operations in 3 other states. The same. Tactics, different company names, all leading back to Meridian Holdings. But something about Copper Valley was different. They'd sent Cole himself, their top pressure man, for what should have been a simple, small-town operation. Diana's interrupted. Revelation about the mining surveys nagged at Sarah's mind. She pulled up the town's historical archives on her laptop. The real ones, not the conveniently fire-damaged copies in the courthouse. The Ghost Dragons had taught her to always keep backups of important information. The mining surveys from 1887 showed something interesting, a geological anomaly beneath downtown Copper Valley that had never been fully explained. The original prospectors had abandoned the area, despite promising initial findings, their notes cryptically referring to water concerns and unstable formations. A knock at her door interrupted her research. On the security feed, she saw Mrs. Rodriguez from the bakery, but something was off about her posture. Sarah zoomed in. There was a man just out of frame, his stance suggesting he was armed. "Come in, Mrs. Rodriguez," Sarah called out, simultaneously activating a program on her laptop. If Cole's men thought they could use her neighbors as leverage, they were about to learn a painful lesson. The elderly baker entered, her usually cheerful face strained. Behind her came a man Sarah didn't recognize. Expensive suit, but with the hard eyes of someone used to wet work rather than boardrooms. "Mrs. Chen," the man's voice was professionally pleasant. "My associate, Mr. Cole, suggested a follow-up conversation. Might be productive." "Did he?" Sarah continued preparing for the afternoon rush, her movements unhurried. "And did he suggest using my neighbors as shields, or was that your own innovation?" The man's smile tightened. Let's call it insurance against any unfortunate data releases. Mrs. Rodriguez here has been kind enough to help facilitate our discussion. Sarah met Mrs. Rodriguez's frightened gaze. In Spanish, she said quietly, "Elena, do you trust me?" The baker's eyes widened slightly, but she gave an almost imperceptible nod. Enough chit-chat, the man stepped forward. Mr. Cole was impressed by your resources. He's authorized me to make a new offer, one that could benefit everyone. How generous. Sarah's fingers moved across her phone, sending a pre-prepared signal. Across the street, security cameras she'd modified began shifting positions. And the alternative? Unfortunately, small towns can be dangerous places. Accidents happen, especially to people who are well-liked in the community. His threat was clear. They'd target her neighbors, her customers, anyone she cared about. Sarah's smile made the man pause. It wasn't the expression of a frightened bookstore owner. It was the smile that had once made cartel bosses nervous. "Here's what's about to happen," she said calmly. "In about 30 seconds, Deputy Garcia is going to walk through that door with a warrant. You see, threatening local business owners while carrying an unregistered weapon is still illegal in Arizona." The man's hand moved toward his jacket, but Sarah continued as if she hadn't noticed. "The security cameras across the street have excellent resolution, enough to show the weapon you're carrying and how you forced Mrs. Rodriguez to help you. Those feeds are being streamed directly to the sheriff's office." On cue, the front door opened. Deputy Garcia entered, followed by 2 state troopers. "Everything all right here, Mrs. Chen?" The man froze, his hand still near his concealed weapon. Sarah could see him calculating odds, looking for exits, but she wasn't done. "Oh, and that phone in your pocket? The one you used to record your conversation with Cole about using local residents as leverage? It just uploaded its entire contents to 3 separate servers. Amazing what you can do with modern technology." Mrs. Rodriguez took advantage of the man's surprise to step away from him, moving behind the counter with Sarah. The state troopers moved forward, their hands on their weapons. "You can't prove anything," the man said, but his confidence was cracking. Actually, Sarah pulled up a video on her laptop, showing him forcing Mrs. Rodriguez from her bakery at gunpoint. "I can prove quite a bit. The question is, how much is Cole willing to risk to protect you? Because right now, you're looking at multiple felony charges." The man's arrest was almost anticlimactic. As the state troopers led him away, Sarah turned to Mrs. Rodriguez. "Elena, I'm so sorry you were dragged into this." The baker surprised her with a fierce hug. "Don't apologize, mijita. It's time someone stood up to these thugs." She pulled back, her eyes sharp. "But you're not just a bookstore owner, are you?" Sarah chose her words carefully. "Let's just say, I have experience dealing with people who think they can take whatever they want." After Mrs. Rodriguez left, Sarah returned to her computer. Cole's enforcer had made a crucial mistake. His phone contained direct communications about Phoenix Development's real plans for Copper Valley. The mining surveys weren't just about water rights. There was something else, something valuable enough to risk exposing their entire operation. A message popped up on her secure channel. One of her old contacts had found something interesting. In Meridian Holdings' classified geological surveys, the aquifer under Copper Valley wasn't just water. Initial tests had shown traces of rare earth elements, crucial components for advanced technology. Sarah's mind raced through implications. This wasn't just about controlling water resources. Phoenix Development was trying to secure mineral rights worth potentially billions, using water access as a cover story. Her phone buzzed with a text from Deputy Garcia. "More company vehicles heading into town. Looks like they're setting up some kind of equipment near the old mine entrance." They were accelerating their timeline, probably trying to establish presence before their enforcer could talk to authorities. Sarah began powering up equipment she hadn't used since her Ghost Dragon days. If Phoenix Development wanted to play hardball, they were about to learn why Shadow's name still carried weight in certain circles. Because while they might have resources and manpower, she had something more valuable: 7 years of building, trust in a community worth fighting for, and skills that had been refined rather than dulled by her time running a bookstore. The ghost of the dragons was about to show her teeth, and this time she wasn't fighting for profit. She was protecting a home. Night settled over Copper Valley like a velvet shroud, bringing with it a flurry of activity that most residents never noticed. Phoenix Development's teams had established a perimeter around the old mining office, their equipment humming softly in the darkness. Guards patrolled at regular intervals, their tactical gear and night vision goggles seeming out of place in the quiet desert town. None of them noticed the shadow moving between buildings. Sarah had changed out of her usual bookstore attire into something more practical: dark clothing that allowed freedom of movement while concealing the tools of her former trade. The weight of the lockpicks against her wrist, the small camera in her pocket, even the way she moved through darkness. It all felt like muscle memory awakening. From her vantage point on the roof of the abandoned hardware store, she watched Phoenix Development's operation through high-powered binoculars. Their security was professional but predictable: regular patrols, standard surveillance equipment, the kind of setup that worked well against ordinary threats. But Shadow had never been ordinary. Her earpiece crackled softly. "In position." Deputy Garcia's voice was barely a whisper. "State police are standing by, but they need probable cause to move in." "Understood." Sarah's response was equally quiet. "Just remember, no one moves until I give the signal. We need them to incriminate themselves." The plan was simple but precise. While Phoenix Development focused on their mining survey operation, they'd left their temporary office vulnerable. Not obviously. They had guards, cameras, alarm systems. But Sarah hadn't earned the name Shadow by being stopped by such obstacles. She moved across rooftops with practiced ease, using paths she'd mapped during her first month in town. Most buildings in downtown Copper Valley shared connected attic spaces, a quirk of early 20th century architecture that had fascinated her architectural historian husband. Michael had never known why she'd taken such interest in these structural details. The guards below maintained their patrol pattern, unaware of the figure moving silently above them. Sarah reached the edge of the hardware store's roof, where a narrow gap separated it from Phoenix Development's temporary headquarters. In her Ghost Dragon days, this would have been the moment for high-tech grappling equipment. Tonight, she had something better: intimate knowledge of the building's construction. Pressing against a seemingly solid section of wall revealed a maintenance access panel, part of the original building's design, long forgotten by most. Within moments, she was inside the building's infrastructure, moving through spaces that hadn't seen human presence in decades. Her phone vibrated once, the signal from her surveillance program. Right on schedule, Cole had arrived for a late-night meeting. From her position in the walls, Sarah could hear voices from the main office. "The mineral analysis confirms it," Cole was saying. "The rare earth deposits under downtown are worth billions. We need to move fast before anyone realizes what's really here. The local resistance is becoming problematic." Another voice, one Sarah didn't recognize, that bookstore owner in particular. The boys did some deeper digging into her background. "You're not going to believe what they found." Sarah froze, listening intently. Cole's response was tense. "The Ghost Dragon connection. Yeah, that complicates things, but it also explains why our usual tactics aren't working. We're not dealing with some small-town widow. We're up against Shadow," the unknown voice cursed softly. "Shadow? The infiltration specialist? I thought she was dead or retired." very much alive, and apparently decided to make her last stand protecting a bookstore. Cole's laugh held no humor. But everyone has pressure points. We just need to find hers. What about the husband, Michael Chen? His death was ruled natural causes, but with enough money, medical records can be re-examined. The temperature in the crawl space seemed to drop several degrees. Sarah's fingers tightened on her camera, but she forced herself to remain still, to keep recording. Better yet, Cole continued, we've found some irregularities in his life insurance. And pay out. One anonymous tip to the insurance company about his widow's criminal past, and she'll lose everything she inherited, including that strategic little bookstore of hers. Sarah had heard enough. She activated her phone's connection to Deputy Garcia. Are you getting this? Every word the deputy confirmed. Insurance fraud threats, falsifying medical records. State police are moving into position, but Sarah wasn't done. She needed more than just threats and implications. She needed proof of their entire operation. Carefully, she maneuvered closer. To Cole's office, setting up surveillance equipment that would make Phoenix Development's cameras look like toys. The mining equipment is in place, Cole was saying. Once we start the survey, it won't matter what anyone suspects. The mineral rights will be legally ours before anyone realizes what's really down there. And the water table issue? A convenient accident at the municipal well should convince everyone that selling to us is their only option for reliable water access. After that, we control everything: water, minerals, the whole valley. Perfect. Sarah began transmitting the conversation to multiple secure servers. But just as she prepared to withdraw, a floorboard creaked beneath her weight. The voices in the office stopped. What was that? The unknown voice was suddenly alert. Probably just the building settling, Cole replied, but Sarah could hear him. Moving toward the wall where she was hidden, years of training took over. As Cole approached the wall, Sarah was already moving, using the building's infrastructure to disappear into darker recesses. She heard him press against the wall, probably searching for signs of intrusion. The ghost stories about this place are getting to you, Cole said to his companion, but his voice held a note of uncertainty. If he only knew how right he was about ghosts. Sarah smiled in the darkness as she made her way to her exit point. She had what she needed: proof of their real plans, recorded threats, evidence of multiple criminal conspiracies. But as she prepared to leave, one final exchange caught her attention. What about the Chen woman's past? Her ghost dragon connections? Cole's response was chilling. Already taken care of. Our friends in certain federal agencies are very interested in the last surviving member of the Ghost Dragons. By this time, tomorrow, she'll be too busy dealing with federal investigators to interfere with our plans. Sarah's mind raced as she slipped out of the building. They were planning to move against her on multiple fronts: legal, financial, and criminal. In her ghost dragon days, she would have disappeared, gone to ground until the heat died down. But Copper Valley was her home now, and Shadow hadn't survived this long by playing defense. Back in her bookstore's hidden basement office, Sarah began composing messages to contacts she hadn't used in years. If Phoenix Development wanted to dig up ghosts, she would show them exactly why the ghost dragons had been feared across the criminal underworld. Her computer chirped, alerts from her surveillance system. More vehicles were arriving in town, but these weren't Phoenix Development's usual black SUVs. These were unmarked federal vehicles. The game was escalating. Cole thought he could use her past against her, thought federal pressure would make her retreat. What he didn't understand was that Shadow had never been more dangerous than when cornered, and this time she wasn't fighting to survive. She was fighting to protect something worth dying for. Deputy Garcia's voice crackled over her secure line. "Sarah, we've got a problem. The FBI just showed up at the station asking questions about you. And there's something else. They're saying Michael's Death might not have been natural causes. Sarah's fingers stilled on her keyboard. They were really going to play that card, use her husband's memory as a weapon against her. Cole had just made a fatal mistake, because while Sarah Chen might run a bookstore, Shadow had been legendary, for a reason. And anyone who threatened Michael's memory was about to learn why the ghost dragons had been feared not for their violence, but for their ability to destroy enemies from within. Sarah moved through her bookstore's hidden basement, office with practiced efficiency, gathering equipment she hadn't touched in years. From a concealed safe behind a false wall panel, she retrieved items that would make federal investigators very interested indeed. Evidence of Phoenix Development's operations in other towns, documentation of their real mineral surveys, proof of their connection to suspicious accidents and questionable deaths. Her secure computer terminal displayed multiple feeds, surveillance from around town, police-band communications, and most importantly, a direct tap into Phoenix Development's network. They thought their systems were secure. They hadn't realized that Shadow had written some of the security protocols they were using back in her Ghost Dragon days. Got more movement at the mining office. Tommy Martinez's voice came through her encrypted channel. The teenager had proven surprisingly adept at surveillance, his paper route providing perfect cover for monitoring Phoenix Development's activities. They're bringing in some kind of drilling equipment, looks heavy-duty. Sarah checked her monitors. The drilling rig was military-grade, designed for quick geological sampling. They were accelerating their timeline. Mrs. Chen, Diana Voss's voice crackled over another channel. The former Phoenix Development employee was safely hidden in a safe house outside Phoenix, but her access codes still worked. I've got something. They're moving large sums of money through offshore accounts. Looks like payoffs to federal officials. Send me everything, Sarah instructed, her fingers flying over her keyboard. And Diana, thank you. I know the risk you're taking. They killed my sister. Diana's voice was hard. Made it look like an accident when she threatened to expose their operation in Nevada. It's time someone stopped them. Sarah's screens lit up with incoming data. Phoenix Development's financial web was complex but familiar. The Ghost Dragons had used similar structures for their own operations. The difference was Sarah had learned from the best about how to make such arrangements collapse. A soft knock at her hidden door made her tense, but the security feed showed Mrs. Rodriguez carrying what appeared to be a heavy box. "Enter!" Sarah called out, activating the electronic lock. The elderly baker stepped into the hidden office, her eyes widening at the array of technology. Dios mío. When you said you had experience with these types, the less you know, the better, Sarah said gently. What do you have for me? Mrs. Rodriguez set down the box. Papers, records, every threat, every accident, every strange incident in Copper Valley for the past year. The community has been keeping track, even if we didn't know what to do about it. Sarah opened the box, finding meticulously documented incidents. Dates, times, witnesses. The kind of detail that federal investigators loved. The community hadn't been as helpless as Phoenix Development assumed. Her phone buzzed. Deputy Garcia. Sarah, got word from my contact in the FBI. The agent's asking. Questions about you? They're not really FBI. Someone's using fake credentials. Interesting. Cole was getting desperate, using federal impersonators to pressure her. Amateur move. The real FBI would be very interested in that development. Tommy to Shadow. The teenager's voice was urgent. Mr. Cole just arrived at the mining office. He's with some guys in suits, not their usual muscles. They look official. Sarah switched feeds, focusing on the mining office cameras. The men with Cole moved with military precision, not private security, but something else. Their bearing suggested a special operations background. Those aren't FBI, she murmured, recognizing the type. They're mercenaries, probably former special forces hired to make sure the mineral extraction happens regardless of local resistance. Mrs. Rodriguez crossed herself. Dios mío. What can we do against people like that? Sarah smiled grimly. Watch and learn. She activated her communication network. All observers maintain positions. No engagement. Let them think they have the advantage. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, accessing systems she hadn't used since her Ghost Dragon days. Within moments, she had complete access to Phoenix Development's communication network. Their encryption was good, but she'd spent years teaching corporations how to protect themselves by showing them how vulnerable they were. Got something? Diana's voice crackled. Cole's scheduling an emergency meeting with all field operatives. Tomorrow night at the mining office. Looks like they're planning to start drilling regardless of permits or approval. Perfect. Sarah began composing messages using old Ghost Dragon protocols. Time to remind them why shadows are dangerous. The sound of vehicles outside drew her attention to the street cameras. The fake federal agents were making a show of investigating her bookstore, probably hoping to intimidate her customers. But they had made a crucial mistake. Mrs. Rodriguez, Sarah turned to the baker, I need you to spread the word. Quietly, tell everyone to be at the community center tomorrow night, and make sure they bring those records you just showed me. The elderly woman nodded, understanding dawning in her eyes. You're going to trap them? No. Sarah's smile held no warmth. I'm going to let them trap themselves. Phoenix Development thinks they can use my past to destroy my present. Instead, I'm going to use their present to destroy their future. After Mrs. Rodriguez left, Sarah accessed one final system, a hidden server containing everything she knew about Phoenix Development's operation. With a few keystrokes, she began distributing the information to specific targets: federal prosecutors, investigative journalists, and most importantly, the corporate competitors who would be very interested in Phoenix Development's illegal mineral surveys. Her phone buzzed with a message from an encrypted number she hadn't seen in years. Shadow. Heard you're dancing again. The old crew's gone, but some of us, remember, need help. Sarah considered the offer. Having backup from her old world would be useful, but this wasn't about the ghost dragons anymore. This was about protecting her. New home, her new family. Keep watching, she typed back. This dance is about to get interesting. Through her monitors, she watched Cole and his mercenaries examining the mining office's perimeter. They moved with professional precision, but there was an urgency to their actions that suggested pressure from above. They needed this operation to succeed. Too bad they didn't understand the first rule of infiltration. The more desperately you need something, the more vulnerable you become to someone who knows how to exploit that desperation. Sarah began powering up systems she hadn't used since her Ghost Dragon days, but this time they would serve a different purpose. Instead of stealing secrets, she would use them to protect something precious. Instead of destroying lives for profit, she would save a community from destruction. The night deepened over Copper Valley, but in her hidden office, Shadow was wide awake. Tomorrow, Phoenix Development would learn why the Ghost Dragons had been legendary, not for their violence, but for their ability to turn an enemy's own plans into their destruction. And this time, she wasn't fighting alone. An entire community stood with her, ready to protect their home from those who would destroy it for profit. The last dragon was awakening, and her shadow would prove far more dangerous than any mercenary force or corporate scheme. Because while they fought for money, she fought for something far more precious, a home worth protecting and a husband's memory worth honoring. Dawn broke over Copper Valley with an eerie calm. The morning sun revealed fresh tire tracks in the desert dust. Phoenix Development's vehicles had been busy all night, moving equipment and personnel into position around the old mining office. Their mercenaries maintained a visible presence on the streets, their professional demeanor doing little to mask the implicit threat in their watchful gazes. But it wasn't their operation that had the town buzzing. "Did you hear?" Mrs. Rodriguez whispered to her morning customers. "The fake FBI agents who were asking about Mrs. Chen. They were arrested an hour ago by the real FBI. Something about federal impersonation charges." The news spread through town like wildfire, though few knew the full story. None of the federal impersonators had expected their credentials to trigger silent alerts in law enforcement databases. Alerts programmed by someone who knew exactly how to catch fake federal agents. In her bookstore, Sarah calmly served coffee to her morning regulars while monitoring multiple feeds on her hidden laptop. The arrests had been just the first domino to fall. Now, she watched as Phoenix Development scrambled to contain the damage. "They're pulling personnel files," Diana reported through their secure channel, trying to figure out who could have exposed their fake agents. Cole's in a panic. He just got off the phone with someone called the director. It didn't sound pleasant. Sarah's fingers flew over her keyboard, tracking the digital ripples of Phoenix Development's response. Their cybersecurity teams were good, but they were following predictable protocols. They hadn't realized that every defensive measure they took was actually leading them into carefully laid traps. Mrs. Chen, Tommy Martinez, approached the counter, his newspaper delivery bag notably lighter than usual. "People are talking about last night, about the arrests. Some are saying you had something to do with it." Sarah studied the teenager thoughtfully. His natural curiosity and observational skills had proven invaluable over the past days. "What do you think, Tommy?" "I think—" He glanced around before continuing in a lower voice. "I think the ghost dragons weren't just criminals. They were more like modern Robin Hoods. And maybe one of them decided to protect our town." Before Sarah could respond, the door chimed. Cole strode in, his usual smooth confidence replaced by barely controlled anger. Two of his mercenaries flanked him, their stances professional but tense. "Quite a show this morning," Cole's voice carried across the quiet store. "Federal agents arrested, our security compromised, sensitive information leaked to competitors. You've been busy, Mrs. Chen. Or should I say, Shadow?" Sarah continued, wiping down the counter, her movements unhurried. "Coffee, Mr. Cole. You look like you could use some. Long night?" "Drop the act." Cole moved closer, his mercenaries spreading out to cover the exits. "You think exposing our fake agents changes anything? You've just forced us to accelerate our timeline. By tonight the drilling begins, and if anyone tries to interfere—" He let the threat hang. "Interesting choice," Sarah's voice remained calm. "Using private military contractors for a mining operation. Expensive, almost like you're expecting resistance." Cole's eye twitched slightly. "Professional security is standard for valuable operations." "Of course." Sarah began preparing a fresh pot of coffee, the familiar routine masking how her mind calculated angles, distances, potential weapons. "Though I wonder what your investors would think about the expense, especially given recent developments." "What developments?" Cole's attempt at casual inquiry didn't quite mask his concern. As if on cue, his phone buzzed. The color drained from his face as he read the message. Sarah didn't need to see it. She knew exactly what information had just been leaked to Meridian. Holdings Board of Directors. "Impossible," Cole muttered, frantically typing on his phone. "Those records were secured. The accounts were hidden." "Nothing's ever truly hidden," Sarah said quietly. "The ghost dragons taught me that, just like they taught me that the best way to destroy an operation isn't through violence, it's through information." Cole's mercenaries shifted uneasily as their employer's composure cracked further. What did you do?" "Me? I just run a bookstore." Sarah's smile held no warmth. "But it seems someone has been sharing some very interesting documents with various parties, federal regulators, environmental agencies, investigative journalists, even your competitors in the mineral rights industry." The door chimed again. This time it was Deputy Garcia, accompanied by two men in actual FBI windbreakers. "Mr. Cole, we need you to come with us. Seems there are some questions about your company's recent activities." Cole's hand twitched toward his jacket, but his mercenaries were already backing away. They were professionals. They could recognize when an operation was blown. "You don't understand." Cole's voice held an edge of desperation. "The minerals under this town, the potential value—" "Oh, we understand completely," one of the FBI agents cut in. "In fact, we're very interested in discussing Phoenix Development's pattern of using fraudulent environmental surveys to seize mineral rights. Not to mention the suspicious accidents that seem to follow your operations." As Cole was led away, Sarah noticed Tommy trying to hide a grin. The teenager had played his part perfectly. His paper route had provided ideal cover for distributing evidence to key people throughout town, but this wasn't over. Sarah knew Cole was just one piece of a larger operation. His arrest would send ripples through Phoenix Development's hierarchy, forcing them to either retreat or escalate. Her phone buzzed with messages from her surveillance network. More vehicles were arriving at the mining office, not mercenaries this time, but men in expensive suits. The corporate hierarchy was coming to contain the situation personally. "They're moving the drilling equipment," Diana reported. "Looks like they're planning to start operations immediately, before the permits can be officially revoked." Sarah had expected this. Core like Phoenix Development didn't abandon valuable targets easily. If they couldn't take Copper Valley legally, they'd try to create facts on the ground that would be difficult to reverse. "Mrs. Chen," Tommy's voice drew her attention back to the store. "There's something else. While I was delivering papers, I saw them unloading some kind of containers at the mining office. They looked weird, like hazmat stuff." Sarah's mind raced through implications. If Phoenix Development was bringing in hazardous materials, they weren't just planning unauthorized drilling, they were setting up for something much worse. "Time to call in some old favors," she murmured, reaching for her secure phone. The ghost dragons might be gone, but their information network had been legendary for a reason. Within minutes, she had confirmation. Phoenix Development had acquired industrial chemicals typically used for aggressive mineral extraction. They weren't just planning to drill, they were preparing to poison the aquifer, creating an environmental crisis that would force the town to accept their help. "All observers, maintain positions," Sarah broadcast through her secure network. "But be ready. Tonight we show them why you don't threaten a community protected by shadows." The morning sun climbed higher over Copper Valley, its harsh light illuminating the growing activity around the mining office. Phoenix Development thought Cole's arrest was just a setback, that they could still force through their operation with enough money and muscle. They didn't understand that Shadow had never worked alone. The ghost dragons had been feared not just for their skills, but for their ability to turn entire communities into weapons against their enemies. And this time, she had something even more powerful than her old crew, a town full of people who had learned to fight back, each in their own way. From Tommy's intelligence gathering to Mrs. Rodriguez's network of informants, from Deputy Garcia's law enforcement connections to Diana's inside knowledge, Copper Valley had become more than just a target. It had become a trap. Sarah began activating systems she'd spent years preparing, not for crime, but for protection. Phoenix Development thought they were dealing with one retired ghost dragon. They were about to learn they were facing an entire community that had learned to move in shadows. Because while Cole rotted in a federal holding cell, his bosses were walking into something far more dangerous than a simple mining operation. They were walking into the killing ground of the last dragon, where every shadow held secrets and every friendly face masked a potential enemy. The real ghost story of Copper Valley was about to begin. The community center's basement had never been so crowded. As evening approached, people filtered in through various entrances, using routes Sarah had carefully mapped out to avoid Phoenix Development's surveillance. The gathered crowd represented every facet of Copper Valley: shop owners, teachers, ranch hands, and even a few county officials who'd grown tired of corporate bullying. "They're moving more equipment into position," Deputy Garcia reported, spreading aerial photos across a makeshift command center. "Environmental sensors show they're preparing to inject something into the groundwater system, some kind of chemical catalyst to speed up mineral extraction." Sarah studied the photos, her trained eye catching details others might miss. The equipment wasn't just for mining, it was military grade, designed for rapid deployment and quick extraction. Phoenix Development was preparing to strip mine the valley's resources and disappear before anyone could stop them. "What about the hazmat containers Tommy spotted?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by grim determination. "Industrial-grade acids," Diana's voice came through the secure video link from her safe house. "They're planning to create an environmental disaster that would force evacuations. Once people are displaced, property values plummet. They swoop in, buy everything for pennies, then discover valuable mineral deposits during cleanup." Murmurs of anger rippled through the crowd. This wasn't just about water rights anymore. It was about the deliberate destruction of their home. "But that's not the worst part," Diana continued, her face grim on the video screen. "I've been going through their internal communications, the chemicals they're planning to use. They're designed to make any contamination look natural, like it was caused by old mining operations. They're going to poison our water and make it look like it was our own fault." Sarah moved to the center of the room, and the crowd instinctively quieted. They'd learned over the past days to recognize when Shadow was about to speak. "Phoenix Development thinks they understand this town," her voice carried clearly despite its soft tone. "They see what they want to see, a small community they can bully and manipulate. What they don't realize is that every person in this room has skills they never counted on." She turned to Tommy Martinez and his friends. "Our young observers have mapped their patrol patterns, identified blind spots in their security." The teenagers stood straighter, proud of their contribution. Mrs. Rodriguez and her network have documented every threat, every suspicious incident. The elderly baker nodded grimly, clutching a thick folder of evidence. Deputy Garcia and his officers have maintained their professional duties while quietly gathering evidence of criminal activity. The law enforcement officers present, exchanged knowing looks. "And Diana," Sarah gestured to the screen, "has provided us with insider knowledge that turns their own plans against them." "But what can we actually do?" someone called out. "They've got mercenaries, chemicals, corporate backing." Sarah's smile held an edge that reminded everyone that before she was Mrs. Chen, the bookstore owner, she had been Shadow of the Ghost Dragons. "We don't fight them directly," she explained. "We fight them the way shadows fight, by being everywhere and nowhere, by turning their own weapons against them, by making them fear what they can't see." She moved to a large map of Copper Valley displayed on the wall. "They think they know this town's secrets. They don't. The Prohibition-era tunnels they discovered, there are older passages beneath them, dating back to the original mining operations, passages that don't appear on any modern maps. The surveillance systems they've set up," she pointed to marked locations. "Every camera they install becomes our eye into their operation. Every communication they send becomes our intelligence. But most importantly," her voice hardened slightly, "every person they've threatened, every business they've pressured, every official they've tried to bribe, all of it has been documented, catalogued, and prepared for release to exactly the right authorities at exactly the right moment." The room was silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about protecting their town. It was about turning Phoenix Development's own tactics into a weapon against them. Mrs. Rodriguez, Sarah turned to the baker, your delivery network reaches every business in town. How quickly can you distribute emergency supplies if needed? Within hours, the elderly woman replied firmly. We've already started stockpiling. Water and essentials in secure locations. Tommy, she addressed the teenager, your paper route observers. Ready? He grinned. We've got every street mapped, every Phoenix Development vehicle tagged. They can't move without us knowing. Deputy Garcia? The officer straightened. State police are on standby. The moment we have proof of environmental crimes, they move in. And, he smiled slightly, we've got some interesting federal agencies, very interested in Phoenix Development's pattern of operations. Sarah nodded, then turned to the video screen. Diana, their internal network is compromised, the former Phoenix Development employee reported. Every document, every communication, every secret they think is secure, I can access it all, and I've set up dead man's switches. If anything happens to any of us, everything goes public. Which brings us to tonight's operation, Sarah continued. They're planning to start chemical injection at midnight, thinking the town will be asleep. Instead, we're going to give them exactly what they want, evidence of their own crimes, documented, from multiple angles, impossible to deny or cover up. She began assigning roles, observation teams, documentation units, emergency response coordinators. Each person had a part to play. Each skill would be utilized. Remember, she emphasized, this isn't about confrontation, it's about documentation and exposure. Let them think they're succeeding right up until the moment everything falls apart. As the meeting broke up, people leaving in small groups through different exits, Mrs. Rodriguez approached Sarah privately. You're not telling them everything, the baker said quietly. About what really happens at midnight. Sarah met her gaze steadily. Some things are better left in the shadows. Just make sure everyone is clear of the mining office by 11:45. After everyone had gone, Sarah returned to her bookstore's hidden command center. The screen showed Phoenix Development's increasing activity, more equipment arriving, mercenaries, establishing defensive positions, corporate executives arriving in expensive cars. They thought they were preparing for a simple operation. They didn't realize they were walking into a trap 7 years in the making. Her phone buzzed with a message from an encrypted number. Shadow, the old network is ready. Your call. Sarah smiled grimly as she began powering up systems that had laid dormant since her Ghost Dragon days. Phoenix Development was about to learn why the criminal underworld had feared Shadow, not for her ability to steal secrets, but for her talent at making powerful organizations destroy themselves. As night fell over Copper Valley, lights began going out across town. Not from power failures, but from residents executing their parts of the plan. In the growing darkness, shadows deepened, and in those shadows, a community prepared to protect itself, because while Phoenix Development had money, mercenaries, and corporate backing, they'd forgotten the most important rule of operating in shadows. Sometimes the darkness itself is the enemy, and in Copper Valley, every shadow answered to one person, the last Ghost Dragon, who had found something worth protecting. In her bookstore's basement command center, Sarah activated a series of monitors she'd installed years ago, not for book selling, but for exactly this kind of situation. Each screen showed a different aspect of Phoenix Development's operation, their own security cameras now serving as windows into their activities. Got movement at the north entrance, Tommy's voice came through her encrypted channel. They're bringing in some kind of specialized drilling equipment, looks military grade. Confirmed, Diana added from her safe house. Just access their requisition orders. It's experimental technology designed for rapid mineral extraction, highly illegal, without proper environmental impact studies. Sarah's fingers flew over her keyboard, documenting everything. "Mrs. Rodriguez, are your people in position?" "See." The baker's voice was firm. "Every business owner who refused to sell has their cameras ready. The moment they start the chemical injection, we'll have evidence from 20 different angles." Through her surveillance network, Sarah watched Phoenix Development's executives arrive for their midnight operation. They moved with the confidence of people who thought they held all the cards, unaware that every step they took was being recorded, every conversation documented. "Found something interesting in their communications," Diana reported. "They're not just after the rare earth minerals. There's something else in the geological surveys, something they're trying to keep off official records." "And what kind of something?" Deputy Garcia asked over the secure line. "Not sure yet, but whatever it is, it's got their board of directors personally involved. These corporate types don't usually get their hands dirty with field operations." Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. In her Ghost Dragon days, she'd learned that when corporate executives took personal risks, it usually meant they were hiding something bigger than profit margins. "Tommy," she called out, "remember those old mining maps your grandfather showed us? The ones from before the town was founded?" "Yeah," the teenager replied. "They showed some kind of natural formation under downtown, but the original prospectors avoided it. Said it was cursed or something." "Get me those maps," Sarah instructed. "I think Phoenix Development found something in the original surveys that the first miners knew to leave alone." As midnight approached, more pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. Diana's deep dive into corporate records revealed a pattern. Phoenix Development had targeted other towns with similar geological features, always using environmental disasters as cover for their real operations. "Got the maps," Tommy announced, slightly out of breath from running. "And Mrs. Chen, there's something else. My grandfather's journals mentioned that the original miners found some kind of underground chamber. They sealed it up because whatever was down there scared them enough to abandon a profitable mine." Sarah studied the ancient maps, her trained eye catching details others might miss. The cursed formation wasn't natural, it was artificial, something built long before the town existed. "They're not just after minerals," she realized. "They're looking for whatever's in that chamber. The rare earth elements are just a bonus. But what could be valuable enough to risk contaminating an entire town's water supply?" Mrs. Rodriguez wondered. "Maybe it's not about value," Deputy Garcia suggested. "Maybe it's about keeping something hidden, something they don't want anyone else to find." Sarah's screens showed more equipment being moved into position around the mining office. The mercenaries had established a tight perimeter, their night vision gear giving them confidence in the darkness. What they didn't realize was that Sarah had spent years mapping the true darkness beneath Copper Valley. The tunnels, they discovered, were just the surface layer. Beneath them lay older passages, forgotten chambers, and secrets that had kept their silence for centuries. "All teams, final positions," she broadcast through her secure network. "Remember, no direct confrontation. Let them think they're in control right up until the moment everything changes." Her phone buzzed with confirmation messages from throughout town. Every piece was in place: observers with cameras, evidence gatherers with recording equipment, emergency response teams ready to document environmental violations. But there was one more piece, one she hadn't shared with the others. In her Ghost Dragon days, Shadow had been legendary not just for gathering intelligence, but for using it to create elaborate traps. Phoenix Development thought they were executing a simple midnight operation. Instead, they were walking into an intricately layered web of their own making. Every action they took would generate evidence against them. Every attempt to cover their tracks would only dig them deeper. "Mrs. Chen," Tommy's voice carried a note of concern, "there's something else in my grandfather's journals about why they sealed that chamber. He wrote something about voices in the dark, about how the deeper they dug, the more the workers started seeing things. Sarah smiled grimly as she began powering up equipment that had nothing to do with bookselling. Good. Let's give Phoenix Development some ghosts to chase. Because while they might have mercenaries and military hardware, they were about to learn why the ghost dragons had been feared across the criminal underworld. It wasn't just about stealing secrets or gathering intelligence. It was about understanding that the most dangerous shadows were the ones you cast yourself. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Sarah sent one final message through her old network. The dance begins. Watch and remember why shadows were feared. Sarah's computer chirped with an incoming transmission from Diana. You need to see this. The former Phoenix Development employee's voice was tense. I've managed to decrypt some of their older geological surveys. The chamber they're looking for, it's not just one chamber, it's part of a network. Some kind of ancient underground complex. On her screens, Sarah pulled up the encrypted files Diana was sending. The surveys showed something remarkable. A series of interconnected chambers beneath Copper Valley, their layout too precise to be natural formations. That's not all, Diana continued. Found references to similar sites in their classified files. 3 other locations across the southwest where they've used the same playbook, environmental disasters, to clear out towns sitting above these underground complexes. What happened to those towns? Tommy asked, his voice barely a whisper. They're ghost towns now, Diana replied grimly. Official records blame chemical spills, groundwater contamination, but the real operations happened after everyone was evacuated. Whatever Phoenix Development found in those other chambers, they went to extreme lengths to keep it quiet. Sarah's mind raced through implications. In her Ghost Dragon days, she'd learned to recognize when a target was more than it appeared. This wasn't just about mineral rights or water control. Phoenix Development was hunting something specific, something they didn't want anyone else to find. Mrs. Rodriguez, she called out over the secure channel, those stories you mentioned about the town's early days. What exactly did the first settlers say about this area? The elderly baker was quiet for a moment. My grandmother used to tell tales, said the native peoples wouldn't build here, called it the whispering place, said the ground itself held secrets that should stay buried. Through her surveillance network, Sarah watched Phoenix Development's teams making final preparations. Their equipment wasn't just for mining, some of it looked more suited to archaeology than mineral extraction. Deputy Garcia, what's the status on those hazmat containers? Getting readings now, the officer replied. But something's odd. The chemicals, they're not just for mineral extraction. Some of these compounds are used in artifact preservation. A new message flashed across Sarah's screen, an automated alert from one of her old Ghost Dragon monitoring systems. Someone was accessing highly classified military files about Copper Valley, files that predated the town's founding. They're not trying to destroy evidence, she realized. They're trying to preserve something. The environmental disaster is just cover for their real operation. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, accessing databases she hadn't touched in years. The Ghost Dragons had maintained detailed records of unusual government activities, including classified archaeological operations. Got something, she announced. 1947 military survey of the area. Most of it's redacted, but there's a reference to anomalous artifacts and structures of unknown origin. Mrs. Chen? Tommy's voice shook slightly. Remember how my grandfather's journals mentioned voices? In the dark, last night when I was observing their operation, I heard something, coming from the old mine shaft, like whispers, but not in any language I know. Sarah's screens showed Phoenix Development's mercenaries establishing final positions around the mining office. Their formation wasn't just defensive. They were setting up containment protocols, the kind used for securing sensitive archaeological sites. All teams, adjust accordingly, she broadcast. This isn't just about stopping an environmental crime. Whatever's down there, they're willing to destroy an entire town to get it. We need to document everything. Her phone buzzed with a message from an encrypted number she hadn't seen in decades. Shadow, military black sites showing unusual activity. Something big is coming. Whatever you're into, be careful. Some secrets are kept buried for a reason. Sarah studied her monitors, watching Phoenix Development's operation unfold. They had the money, the equipment, and the manpower. What they didn't have was decades of experience in turning secrets into weapons. Because while they might be hunting ancient mysteries, they were about to learn why the ghost dragons had been legendary in the criminal underworld. It wasn't just about stealing secrets or gathering intelligence. It was about understanding that some shadows were older than any human organization, and some spirits didn't need ghost stories to be dangerous. In her command center, Sarah began activating systems that had nothing to do with bookselling or even her ghost dragon days. These were older protocols, discovered during her years of quiet research in Copper Valley, because while Phoenix Development thought they were executing a classified operation, they were really walking into something far more ancient and dangerous. The real mystery of Copper Valley was about to reveal itself, and even the shadows might not be ready for what emerged from the depths. The desert night shattered with the sound of drilling equipment powering up. From her vantage point in the old clock tower, Sarah watched Phoenix Development's operation through high-powered optics. Their floodlights cast harsh shadows across the mining office grounds, where teams of workers in protective gear moved with practiced efficiency. Main drill team is in position, Tommy reported through their secure channel. But something's wrong. They're not following standard mining protocols. The drill, it's not aimed at mineral deposits. They're going straight for that chamber. Sarah's enhanced microphones picked up fragments of conversation from the operation below. The workers seemed nervous, jumping at shadows despite the bright lights and armed security. "Ma'am," Deputy Garcia's voice was tense. "Just got word from the state police. All communication with Copper Valley is being jammed. Someone's using military-grade equipment to isolate the town." Before Sarah could respond, her screens lit up with incoming data. Diana had managed to breach Phoenix Development's secure servers, accessing real-time communications between the site and their corporate headquarters. "Director Kane is on site," Diana reported, referring to Phoenix Development's shadowy leader who rarely left their corporate offices. "Direct orders from him. Secure the artifact at all costs. Containment protocols in effect." Through her surveillance network, Sarah caught glimpses of a distinguished man in an expensive suit, directing operations from a mobile command center. Director Kane moved with the authority of someone used to wielding power, but there was something else. In his bearing, urgency, almost desperation. "The drilling's affecting the old tunnels," Mrs. Rodriguez called in. "We're getting strange readings from all the sensor equipment you had us plant. And people are hearing things. Whispers, like Tommy mentioned, but they're getting louder." Sarah's screens showed thermal imaging of the drilling site. The equipment was generating enormous heat, but there were cold spots appearing where none should exist. Patches of absolute darkness that seemed to swallow the infrared sensor's capability to read them. "Director Kane," a technician's voice crackled through their intercepted communications. "We've reached the outer chamber wall. But, sir, these readings, they don't match any known material composition." "Proceed with extraction," Kane's command was sharp. "Whatever's down there, we will secure it tonight, before anyone else discovers what we've found." Sarah's fingers flew over her keyboard, correlating data from multiple sources. The ghost dragons had maintained extensive files on unusual government operations, including classified archaeological finds, but nothing in their records matched what she was seeing. "Mrs. Chen?" Tommy's voice shook slightly. The whispers. They're not coming from the mine anymore. They're coming from everywhere, and people are starting to see things in the shadows. Things that shouldn't be there. A series of rapid alerts flashed across Sarah's screens. The drilling operation had breached something, but it wasn't just the underground chamber. Sensor readings showed energy patterns rippling through. The old tunnel network, spreading outward like a web beneath the town. All observers report, she broadcast. What exactly are people seeing? The responses came in rapid succession, shapes moving against the wind, lights where there shouldn't be any, shadows that don't match their sources. Reflections of things that aren't there. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. In her ghost dragon days, she'd encountered many strange things, but nothing like this. Phoenix Development hadn't just found an archaeological site. They'd stumbled onto something that defied conventional understanding. Her secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from one of her oldest contacts. Shadow military satellites, detecting massive energy signature beneath Copper Valley. Whatever you're involved in, get out now. Some doors aren't meant to be opened, but evacuation wasn't an option. This was her home, her community. And whatever Phoenix Development had awakened, it was spreading beyond their control. Through her surveillance network, she watched Director Kane ordering more equipment into position. Teams in specialized containment gear were deploying around the drilling site, carrying equipment that looked more appropriate for a high-level research facility than a mining operation. Diana, Sarah called out, what else can you find about Kane? Why is he personally overseeing this? Accessing his classified files now, Diana replied. There's a pattern. Every site where they've found these chambers, he's been there. But the files show something else. After each operation, dozens of workers disappeared. Official records list them as transferred, but there's no trace of them afterward. Sarah's screens showed more cold spots appearing throughout town, places where the laws of physics seemed to temporarily suspend. The whispers Tommy had reported were spreading, carrying fragments of languages that had never been spoken by human. Tongues! Mrs. Rodriguez, she commanded, activate the backup generators. Whatever's happening, we need to keep power to the surveillance network. But even as she spoke, lights began failing across town. Not from power loss, the bulbs still worked, but their light seemed to be absorbed by deepening shadows that moved. With purpose, Director Kane! A technician's panicked voice cut through their intercepted communications. The chamber, sir, it's not empty. There's something. The readings indicate movement, but that's impossible. These chambers have been sealed for thousands of years. Kane's response was cold, calculated. Initiate containment protocols. Nothing leaves that chamber without my direct authorization. And if anyone interferes... He paused, looking directly at a security camera Sarah had compromised, as if he knew she was watching. Deal with them permanently. The implications were clear. Phoenix Development wasn't just willing to destroy the town's water supply. They would eliminate anyone who discovered what they were really after. Sarah's fingers moved across her keyboard, activating systems she'd installed years ago. If Kane wanted to play with forces beyond his understanding, she would show him why the ghost dragons had been feared not just for their skills, but for their ability to turn an enemy's own plans against them. Because while Phoenix Development might have military-grade equipment and corporate backing, they had forgotten the first rule of working in shadows. Sometimes the darkness itself is alive, and it remembers those who disturb its rest. Through her network, Sarah watched as more containment teams moved into position. But their formations were sloppy, their movements betraying growing fear. Whatever they had awakened in those ancient chambers was affecting them, making them see things that shouldn't exist. All teams hold positions, she broadcast, but be ready. When those doors open, we're not just documenting corporate crimes anymore. We're witnessing something else entirely. Her screens showed Director Kane entering the mobile command center, his composure cracking slightly as new sensor readings appeared. The whispers were getting louder, carrying echoes of secrets that had been buried for millennia. The real operation was about to begin, and this time even the shadows might not be enough to control what emerged from the depths. The drilling groaned as it bit into the subterranean wall, sending tremors rippling through the ground. Inside the command center, Director Kane's gaze remained fixed on the live feed from the excavation site. Sweat glistened on his forehead, though whether from the heat or something else, no one could say. "Drill team, report status," he barked into his headset. Static answered. Then a voice thick with unease. "Sir, we broke through, but there's something here." Kane leaned forward. "Define something." Before the worker could respond, the feed cut out. A heartbeat later, an unnatural silence settled over the valley. Then came the sound, low, resonant, as if the earth itself was exhaling. Sarah tightened her grip on the edge of the desk. "Diana, what's happening down there?" Diana's voice was hushed. "I don't know, but I think we just woke it up." The monitors flickered, casting erratic shadows across Sarah's command center. The heat signatures from the excavation site had begun shifting, the cold voids expanding outward like grasping fingers. The sensors struggled to interpret the anomalies, spitting out incoherent readings. The airwaves crackle with fragments of panicked voices from Phoenix Development's personnel. "We need to move," Deputy Garcia said, "before whatever's down there decides to come up." Sarah shook her head. "Not yet. We need to see what they found." A new alert pinged on her screen. Diana had breached another security layer. The classified files contained images, grainy but unmistakable, glyphs carved into smooth, unbroken stone, older than any known civilization. The language was unrecognizable, yet something about it felt disturbingly familiar. Then came another file, a photo taken in 1947. A military excavation, men in hazmat suits gathered around an object half buried in rock. Not just a chamber, a vault, and inside it, something that gleamed in the camera flash, a structure composed of a metal unlike any, found on Earth. Sarah exhaled sharply. They didn't just find a ruin, they found something else, something that was sealed away. Outside, the town's few remaining lights dimmed as power grids failed. People stumbled into the streets, staring at the sky where stars flickered unnaturally. The whispers were no longer confined to the tunnels. They were everywhere. Then the screaming started. Sarah turned to her team. "We need to get to that chamber now." Tommy swallowed hard. "And if it's already too late," she met his gaze, "then we find a way to put it back." The ground beneath them rumbled, the vibrations pulsing like a heartbeat. A foul wind rose from the excavation site, carrying the scent of decay and something older, something wrong. In the distance, dark figures shifted in the periphery of vision. Vanishing when looked at directly, Diana gasped. "Sarah, I'm picking up something new on the infrared. It's moving, fast." Sarah's eyes snapped to the screen. Shapes, barely distinguishable, darted through the excavation site. Security teams fired their weapons, but the bullets had no effect. The shadows coiled around them, dragging them into the darkness. Their screams were cut short. "We have to go. Now!" Garcia yelled, already moving toward the exit. Sarah hesitated only a moment before grabbing her gear. Whatever was down there was awake, and it was hungry. On her screens, Sarah pulled up the encrypted files Diana was sending. The surveys showed something remarkable, a series of interconnected chambers beneath Copper Valley, their layout too precise to be natural formations. "That's not all," Diana continued. "Found references to similar sites in their classified files. 3 other locations across the southwest where they've used the same playbook, environmental disasters to clear out towns sitting above these underground complexes." "What happened to those towns?" Tommy asked, his voice barely a whisper. "They're ghost towns now," Diana replied grimly. "Official records blame chemical spills, groundwater contamination. But the real operations happened after everyone was evacuated. Whatever Phoenix development found in those other chambers, they went to extreme lengths to keep it quiet." Sarah's mind raced through implications. In her ghost dragon days, she'd learned to recognize when a target was more than it appeared. This wasn't just about mineral rights or water control. Phoenix development was hunting something specific, something they didn't want anyone else to find. "Mrs. Rodriguez," she called out over the secure channel, "those stories you mentioned about the town's early days. What exactly did the first settlers say about this area?" The elderly baker was quiet for a moment. "My grandmother used to tell tales. Said the native peoples wouldn't build here. Called it the whispering place. Said the ground itself held secrets that should stay buried." Through her surveillance network, Sarah watched Phoenix Development's teams making final preparations. Their equipment wasn't just for mining. Some of it looked more suited to archaeology than mineral extraction. "Deputy Garcia, what's the status on those hazmat containers?" "Getting readings now," the officer replied. "But something's odd. The chemicals, they're not just for mineral extraction. Some of these compounds are used in artifact preservation." A new message flashed across Sarah's screen, an automated alert from one of her old Ghost Dragon monitoring systems. Someone was accessing highly classified military files about Copper Valley, files that predated the town's founding. "They're not trying to destroy evidence," she realized. "They're trying to preserve something. The environmental disaster is just a cover for their real operation." Her fingers flew over the keyboard, accessing databases she hadn't touched in years. The Ghost Dragons had maintained detailed records of unusual government activities, including classified archaeological operations. "Got something," she announced. 1947 military survey of the area. Most of it's redacted, but there's a reference to anomalous artifacts and structures of unknown origin. "Mrs. Chen." Tommy's voice shook slightly. "Remember how my grandfather's journals mentioned voices in the dark? Last night, when I was observing their operation, I heard something coming from the old mine shaft, like whispers, but not in any language I know." Sarah's screen showed Phoenix Development's mercenaries establishing final positions around the mining office. Their formation wasn't just defensive. They were setting up containment protocols, the kind used for securing sensitive archaeological sites. "All teams adjust accordingly," she broadcast. "This isn't just about stopping an environmental crime. Whatever's down there, they're willing to destroy an entire town to get it. We need to document everything." Her phone buzzed with a message from an encrypted number she hadn't seen in decades. "Shadow. Military black sites showing unusual activity. Something big is coming. Whatever you're into, be careful. Some secrets are kept buried for a reason." Sarah studied her monitors, watching Phoenix Development's operation unfold. They had the money, the equipment, and the manpower. What they didn't have was decades of experience in turning secrets into weapons, because while they might be hunting ancient mysteries, they were about to learn why the Ghost Dragons had been legendary in the criminal underworld. It wasn't just about stealing secrets or gathering intelligence. It was about understanding that some shadows were older than any human organization, and some spirits didn't need ghost stories to be dangerous. In her command center, Sarah began activating systems that had nothing to do with bookselling or even her Ghost Dragon days. These were older protocols, discovered during her years of quiet research in Copper Valley, because while Phoenix Development thought they were executing a classified operation, they were really walking into something far more ancient and dangerous. The real mystery of Copper Valley was about to reveal itself, and even the shadows might not be ready for what emerged from the depths. The desert night shattered with the sound of drilling equipment powering up. From her vantage point in the old clock tower, Sarah watched Phoenix Development's operation through high-powered optics. Their floodlights cast harsh shadows across the mining office grounds, where teams of workers in protective gear moved with practiced efficiency. "Main drill team is in position," Tommy reported through their secure channel. "But something's wrong. They're not following standard mining protocols. The drill, it's not aimed at mineral deposits. They're going straight for that chamber." Sarah's enhanced microphones picked up fragments of conversation from the operation below. The workers seemed nervous, jumping at shadows despite the bright lights and armed security. "Ma'am," Deputy Garcia's voice was tense. "Just got word from the state police. All communication with Copper Valley is being jammed. Someone's using military-grade equipment to isolate the town." Before Sarah could respond, her screens lit up with incoming data. Diana had managed to breach Phoenix Development's secure servers, accessing real-time communications between the site and their corporate headquarters. "Director Kane is on site," Diana reported, referring to Phoenix Development's shadowy leader who rarely left their corporate offices. "Direct orders from him. Secure the artifact at all costs. Containment protocols in effect." Through her surveillance network, Sarah caught glimpses of a distinguished man in an expensive suit, directing operations from a mobile command center. Director Kane moved with the authority of someone used to wielding power, but there was something else in his bearing, urgency, almost desperation. Then the ground trembled. A deep, resonant vibration rolled through Copper Valley, rattling windows and sending loose stones skittering down the mountainside. "Sarah," Diana whispered, "something just woke up down there." From the excavation site, a low, resonant hum began to rise, growing in intensity. Sarah's fingers tightened around the console. Whatever Phoenix Development had uncovered, it wasn't just ancient, it was alive. The hum grew into a bone-rattling vibration, rolling through the valley like a living force. Sarah watched as Phoenix Development's teams scrambled to adjust, their floodlights flickering wildly. The excavation site itself seemed to shift, as if the earth was breathing in slow, shuddering gasps. "They're losing control," Diana murmured. Sarah's hands flew across her keyboard, activating emergency measures she had prepared for contingencies like this, not against corporate mercenaries, but against the unknown. "Garcia, get your people to higher ground, now!" The deputy hesitated for only a second before responding. "Understood." The comms crackled with urgent orders as the local police and what few emergency responders remained in Copper Valley began retreating from the epicenter. Meanwhile, the drilling team's feed flickered back online. A grainy video showed a cavernous space beyond the breach, its walls inscribed with the same alien glyphs Sarah had seen in the classified files. The chamber pulsed with an eerie, rhythmic light, illuminating something massive, something shifting. Voice came through the radio, hoarse and frantic. "It's not a vault, it's a prison. We need to—" A guttural shriek cut the transmission. The screen went black. Then the screaming started again, but this time it wasn't just from the workers. It came from the town itself. Sarah's stomach clenched as she turned toward her external cameras. Shadows poured from the excavation site, twisting through the streets, flickering unnaturally. The few remaining townspeople fled, but some weren't fast enough. The darkness caught them, swallowing them in tendrils of inky blackness. Their screams were cut off as they were yanked into the void. Sarah's hands moved faster than her mind, sending out encrypted distress signals on old Ghost Dragon frequencies. It was a long shot, but if there was even a chance that someone out there was listening, they needed backup. "We need to seal it again," Tommy shouted, eyes wide as he pointed to the feed Diana had recovered. The military records from 1947 detailed containment protocols, the use of electromagnetic fields, specific chemical compounds, and, most disturbingly, controlled demolitions of nearby settlements. "That's why they evacuated those towns," Sarah muttered. They weren't just covering their tracks, they were trying to contain this. A new voice broke into their comms, smooth and authoritative. "This is Director Kane. All remaining personnel, fall back to the command post immediately." Sarah narrowed her eyes. "Diana, can you trace that transmission?" "Already on it." Diana's fingers flew over her keyboard. "Got it. He's still inside the mobile command center and, oh damn, Sarah, he's not trying to run. He's waiting for something." The realization hit like a punch to the gut. He's trying to control it. Kane's voice came through again, this time directed at someone in his own ranks. "Containment is failing. Initiate Protocol Omega. We're activating the artifact." Sarah swore under her breath. "They're not sealing it, they're waking it up completely." Below, the chamber erupted in a blast of light, tendrils of pure energy lashing out. The mercenaries near the breach disintegrated instantly, their bodies turning to ash before they could even scream. The ancient glyphs glowed brighter, pulsing, in synchrony with the monstrous force that had been locked away for millennia. And then it emerged, a mass of shifting darkness, its form never settling, towering above the excavation site. 1,000 whispers filled the air, an ancient, unknowable language that burrowed into the mind like writhing worms. Those who had not fled collapsed, clutching their heads, their eyes rolling back as their bodies convulsed. Sarah's vision blurred as the whispers clawed at her consciousness, but she forced herself to focus. "Diana, do we still have control of the excavation site's power grid?" "Yes, but barely. Whatever that thing is, it's interfering with—" "Shut it all down," Sarah ordered. "Now! Everything. Floodlights, drill rigs, generators. Cut the power." Diana hesitated for only a fraction of a second before nodding. With a few keystrokes, the valley plunged into total darkness. For a moment, everything was still. The entity writhed, its form flickering erratically. Without the energy from the excavation site, it seemed weaker. Kane's voice came through, but this time it wasn't calm. "What have you done?" Sarah grabbed her radio, sending it back where it belongs. She turned to Garcia. "Those hazmat containers, can they be used for demolition?" "They contain volatile compounds," he confirmed. "If we detonate them near the breach, do it." Garcia relayed the order, and within moments, controlled explosions rocked the excavation site. The ground caved in, stone and steel collapsing inward. The creature howled, its cries reverberating through the valley as it was pulled back into the abyss. The last thing Sarah saw before the chamber sealed completely was its eyes, an unfathomable depth of hunger, rage, and something else, recognition. Then, silence. The town of Copper Valley stood on the brink, its people forever changed by what had transpired. Phoenix Development's operation was in ruins, its mercenaries either dead or fleeing into the night. Director Kane was gone, whether buried beneath the rubble or escaped, no one could say. Sarah exhaled shakily. "Diana, wipe all records of this from our systems. Keep only what we need." "And Phoenix Development?" Tommy asked. Sarah's eyes hardened. "They won't stop, but neither will we." The desert winds howled as the last embers of the excavation site burned out. The shadows had retreated, for now, but deep beneath the earth, something still waited. Dreaming, remembering. And next time it wouldn't be so easily contained. Sarah turned her gaze toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, in the archives of the world's most secretive organizations, more answers lay hidden. This was only the beginning, and she intended to find the truth before it found them first. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.